Please welcome President Dr. Katrina A. Armstrong.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming to this discussion about the campaigns and the coverage, unpacking politics, media, and the next administration. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the co-sponsors of this event, the Institute of Global Politics at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and our Columbia Journalism School. I'd also like to thank our participants, Karen Yahimilo, Jelani Cobb, Sewell Chan, Drew Gelman, Garrett Haake, and Errin Haines for joining us for this extraordinarily important discussion this evening. I think, as we know, a lot has already been said and written about the 2024 presidential election, and I know that a lot more will be said, a lot more will be written, many, many more discussions will be had over the weeks and months and years to come. As I wrote in my message to our community in advance of the election, it feels, as I'm sure many have said before me, that we live in unusual times. The intensity sometimes of our political disagreement and the divisions that it can cause and represent can feel overwhelming at times. I think many of us can and perhaps are feeling that way right now, with the events and the election coming on the heel of a turbulent time for us, both here at Columbia and across the nation and the world, coming on the heels of a challenging year and of a time of a global pandemic. But as I have continued to say and deeply believe, that as members of this extraordinary university community, of a group and individuals committed to our mission of education, our mission of the creation and dissemination of knowledge, committed to the community and the inclusion, to the debate and respect that that mission requires, that I believe and I know that we can and will move beyond this divisiveness, that we will continue to establish what our fundamental beliefs and our common ground are, as previous generations, really for hundreds of years here at Columbia University, have come together and done and will continue to do, no matter how unusual those times are. Of course, as I say continually, and I know it can sometimes feel repetitive, that we do this because we understand and stay true to our mission, that we know we are here because we must educate generations of leaders to come, that we know that we must advance knowledge and ideas because there's so much more that we can do for society around us, and that we know to do that, that we must promote critical thinking, that we must engage with dialogue on the most challenging ideas, and then we must do that with respect and thought, with empathy, and that I know that that is what will, of course, guide us forward. And of course, I know that we're also here tonight to do exactly that, to help understand this moment, the dynamics, this election, its impact, by bringing together a panel of experts to discuss and analyze it through the prism of media and its coverage. With that, I am honored and delighted to turn the podium over to Karen Yahimilo, the Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, who will provide us a little more context on how this event came together. Thank you again so very, very much for being here and for being part of this incredible university. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Interim President Armstrong. I'm Karen Yahimilo. I'm the Dean of SIPA and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to this important conversation about last week's U.S. presidential election. Tonight's discussion is the final. Well, we think it's the final, but you never know with us. Like maybe next week there will be another one. But today is really what we think is the final in a series of events and workshops that the Institute of Global Politics at SIPA has hosted on this historic election. And today's program emerged from a discussion that Jelani and I had about where we are, what we can and should learn from this election, and what comes next. We are very pleased to be collaborating with the Journalism School tonight, and I am grateful to Dean Jelani Cobb for his partnership in making this happen, and to the President Armstrong and the Office of the President team for their support in hosting and executing this event. As we all know, the presidential election has very high stakes. The occupant of the Oval Office makes decisions that reverberate across the world, and our discussion today will be candid and self-critical. For political scientists, but also pollsters and pundits, I can say that this election has forced many of us to question, to wrestle with our assumptions about the roles of political politics, of public opinions, and to look closely at the role of mainstream as well as alternative media in framing the issues as well as framing the candidates. We will consider how and why many people got public opinion wrong this election cycle, and we will scrutinize the forces that drive political attitudes and decision-making today. We will also examine how the increasing reliance on social media outlets and podcasts for news, rather than traditional journalistic sources, leads to the rapid spread of mis and disinformation in many times, and to people not being exposed to ideas outside their own circles. The outcome of this election marks a moment of change, not only from a Democratic to Republican president, but also from one worldview to another. President-elect Trump's policies and leaderships differ tremendously from those of President Biden, and it is important to start assessing what it will mean at the local, at the national, and the international level, and what factors really have led us here. Doing the hard work of learning from this election cycle is a vital and necessary task. Our university community has the unparalleled expertise and convening power to do just that. We are committed to continuing to provide spaces and opportunities to gather and learn from one another as we all move forward into the next chapter. Now let me introduce the panelists for today. Who will delve into these important concerns. We have Andrew Gelman, is the Higgins Professor of Statistics, a Professor of Political Science, and the Director of the Applied Statistics Center at Columbia University. His research includes the study of why it's rational to vote, why campaign polls are so variable when elections are so predictable, and why redistricting is good for democracy. Errin Haines is the editor-at-large and a founding mother of The 19th, a nonprofit independent newsroom focused on the intersection of gender, politics, and policy, an expert on issues of race, gender, and politics, and she's also an MSNBC contributor. Garrett Haake is a senior congressional correspondent for NBC News, based in Washington, D.C., and appearing regularly on Today, NBC Nightly News, MSNBC. He covered Donald Trump on the campaign trail for over a year and has covered many national breaking news stories from Capitol Hill, the White House, and the 2012, 2016, and 2020 presidential campaigns. And last but certainly not least, we have Sewell Chen is the executive editor of the Columbia Journalism Review. He was previously editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, and before that spent over a decade at the New York Times both as a reporter and an editor. And Sewell will moderate the discussion this evening, and I cannot really thank you all enough for being with us today and look forward to the brilliant conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you so much, Karen, for that very kind introduction, and thank you for Errin, Garrett, and Andrew for joining us, and thank you all for coming. This is a very emotionally charged time for many, and it's a very significant time in the life of our country and our democracy, so I'm really, really glad that we could be here to engage. I'm going to start with a super big question, and then we'll break it down into more digestible chunks. But the big question I'll start with is, how did the press, and I guess for this purpose, for these purposes, I'm defining it as the kind of the mainstream press, but we'll discuss alternative media in a moment. How did the press do in covering this election? How would you rate the field's overall performance? And I want to start with Errin with that question.
Oh, great. First, hi. Thank y'all so much for being here and for helping us to all process this together in public, because I think that that's very much what we are all collectively doing as a country a week plus out from Election Day. So, I do think that the press continues to do a better job. This was President Trump's third time on the ballot. And 2016, I would say the press certainly did not do a great job in covering him definitely underestimated, his popularity with voters, and too many people were surprised on Election Day because I think they didn't take him seriously enough, didn't take his voters seriously enough, right? And so, fast forward to 2020, I think we had gotten to the point by 2020 where maybe we could begin to use words like racially charged, although we were not quite ready to say racist. We were able to, talk about, we had seen, he had a record at that point. He had governed at that point, and so people could, we were able to report on the things that he had actually done, not just things that he said that he was going to do that maybe he was or wasn't going to do, right? Like he had a record that we definitely chronicled. But then, fast forward to 2024, I think a couple of things. I think, again, listening to voters is so important in elections, and I think that we cannot do that enough. I think that there were kind of some narratives that the press kind of went into this election with. Certainly one of them, I have to say abortion being on the ballot, being one of them, and just how important we thought that was going to be. And I think that it was for obviously nearly half the population, but for the other half of the population, it was not the issue that we thought that it was going to be, or people were able to actually split tickets voting for, protecting abortion in their own state while also voting for the person who literally ushers in, the end of federal protections for abortion. But I think the other thing is, continuing to kind of underestimate the former president, thinking, the American people couldn't possibly, be making this choice again, knowing everything that we know, knowing that this person has been out here in our politics for the last 9 years, knowing that he is facing, dozens of criminal, charges, knowing that he has been, adjudicated of civilly of sexually assaulting someone. For his, if we're listening to his voters and we're hearing them say that they feel like his fight is their fight, right? That they believe that he is the person that can address the number one issue for them as a household, the economy. Right? Like if we are hearing them say that, then it just seems to me that there was still some dissonance between the press's perspective and the electorate's perspective. And that is how we find ourselves on the other side of this election.
Garrett, what's your take on the big question, how the press performed?
So I think overall we did a better job than we have done in the past. I think Donald Trump in particular is the most covered individual on the planet. Like, I don't think there's any voter out there who can credibly say that they attempted to educate themselves about this election by watching the news, and they didn't find the information they were looking for about Donald Trump or about the vice president. I think we sort of checked that box pretty clearly.
He may have been the person most covered in all of human history.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think where we could do better, I think to your point about listening to the voters, I think is always a challenge. It's not really reflected in the different ways, the different sort of structure of media. Like cable news doesn't do a particularly good job. We're not built that way. It's a lot of panels, it's a lot of discussion, but it's not necessarily discussion with the person who lives on your street who doesn't have a Trump sign or MAGA hat or wouldn't be caught dead at a rally, but's going to vote for Trump anyway.
But
right?
every time I saw one of those segments, I learned something about the electorate.
Right.
Every single time. So I wish that had happened.
I think there's value in doing more of those things. I think sort of trying to capture the mood of the country is a very imprecise thing, and just doing it with data and polls doesn't do enough. And I think we tried. I know I can only speak for NBC. I didn't get to watch a lot of coverage beyond what we were doing, especially down the stretch. But I know we were constantly trying to capture that piece of it. And I think the other thing that we adjusted along the way, sort of like really traditional media, so like Today Show, nightly news, the kind of stuff that I do, the traditional news package, a minute 50, 2-minute long segment, is not built for covering Donald Trump.
Yeah.
There's no way to cover a 2-hour-long Trump rally and condense it in a digestible way in a 2-hour thing. So we would find more creative ways to structure this. My colleague Laura Jarrett, who covers legal issues for NBC, she's our chief legal correspondent, I think is her exact title. We joked that we were a law firm of Jarrett and Garrett, where like I would come on and do my piece, and then they'd have her on set afterwards being like, Garrett can only talk about this for 10 seconds, but let me explain this in another minute and a half, and trying to find ways to break these things down into more digestible chunks. So I think we did a better job in that way, but I do think, the big challenge is getting viewers who are I think there are two. Getting viewers who are committed to watching the news and sort of using that to actually educate themselves, to understand what their own neighbors think when they're not necessarily talking about politics, right? It's very easy to put the guy in the MAGA hat at the rally on TV, but to get some of these more nuanced perspectives about why people were going to vote for Trump who might have voted for Joe Biden 4 years ago, I think doing that well. And also figuring out, and this is more of a macro problem, I think, for our industry, how to get people who've given up on mainstream media back in the tent. Now, I'd be at these Trump rallies with 5,000 or 6,000 people, and most of them would have no idea who I was or had never seen a story I had done, right? I was ready for more antipathy from Trump supporters at these events than I ever got. And it's because they have their own media ecosystem now. They're not consuming a lot of the news that we're doing. They're watching Real America's Voices or Right Side Broadcasting or Newsmax, outlets in many cases didn't exist until a few years ago.
Or listening to podcasts.
I learned about Theo Vaughn for the first time, and now,
the Manaverse election.
So
sure.
Figuring out how to get those people back into the tent isn't maybe it's a storytelling problem, maybe it's a sort of journalist problem, but I think it's also an industry problem of like, how do we regain our credibility and convince those people to come back in and give us a try and to take us seriously?
We're going to come back to that. Andrew, your take about how the press covered this election.
I guess a large part of the press was the partisan Republican press, and so it seemed that they did not do such a great job of covering the election in the sense of sharing information with their viewers.
But I meant to let's start with the mainstream press, and then we'll discuss.
Okay.
Yep.
My experience with the mainstream press is mostly how they covered polls and uncertainty about polls, and I think they did reasonably well. That the main message was that there's a lot of uncertainty. The election could go either way, which it did. The ultimate election was fairly close in historical terms within the uncertainty that forecasters assessed based on polling errors being off other times. So I think that was conveyed pretty well. It's like when you talk about, I think there was a lot of effort to explain voters for both sides, and had the election been 52-48 in the other direction, then you could say, well, maybe they didn't interview enough of those Harris supporters, whatever. The point is whether the percentage of supporters for each candidate is 49% or 51% or 52%, either way, it's a lot of people. So yeah, I thought they...
Can I add two thoughts to that? I thought it was interesting. so that you corrected him on mainstream press, but I think it's worth pointing out, and this is part of the challenge too. I mean, Fox News is the most watched news organization in the country right now.
It is mainstream.
And they hate the idea of mainstream press, but guess what? That's as mainstream as it gets in terms of total viewership. And I think how we kind of reckon with that and fit them into the ecosystem is important.
Yes.
So let's stay on this. You know, you both work, Errin and Garrett, for high quality news organizations that also produce freely available content, because there are other conversations we could have about how much high quality content's behind paywalls now. That's not true of NBC News. That's not true of the 19th. These are wonderful news sites and programs that are accessible, and yet, like, wow, I mean, NBC News, and yet you would encounter people who appeared to have no. What happened? Is it the decline of terrestrial TV? Is it people? Is it the problem that we identified in 2016 of people now choosing the news sources that fit their ideological inclination rather than reading news widely and seeing where that leads them?
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. And also, I mean, news fatigue is real, right? I mean, people were exhausted from the 2020 election, from the pandemic. They're emerging from that. They were just wanting to check out on politics. They were wanting to check out on the news. And I don't think there was enough of a realization for us that was happening for folks. Because we were all still very much in it, right? We're all still, 2020, we already had an eye to, not only how these last 4 years was going to go, but then ramping back up. I mean, 2 years ago, Trump told us that he was running for re-election, right? So we've been focused on this this entire time while, the rest of the country is surviving and trying to put their lives back together on the other side of a pandemic, right? I think the other part of it, too, though, is, okay, so those people left, where did they go? Like, I don't think that we paid enough attention to where they went. I mean, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the manosphere is real. Like, that is a real place that people were going to and getting information. I'm not going to say necessarily news, but they were definitely getting information over there. And some of it was mis and disinformation, but a lot of it was just, it was, you could learn a lot by spending some time over there, by spending some time on a lot of those podcasts, by spending some time on TikTok, right? Where a lot of the press was still very wedded to Twitter, which evolved into X. Now you've got a lot of outlets that are rethinking their relationship to that platform, given events. But yeah, I mean, I think seeing those people migrate, like, we are in a position of having to chase eyeballs now, right? In a way that we were not, when we were in the days where there were 3 major, television networks and people didn't really have a choice for where they were going to go to get their information, let alone news.
Yeah, and NBC, we're very aware of the sort of go where the viewers are mentality. I mean, we stood up NBC News Now, which is our streaming service, in the last couple of years, and our bosses, I think, made, and I'm not just saying this because they're watching, I think a very smart strategic decision at the jump to not go behind a paywall with it, which CNN did not do with their original streaming service. The fact that it's freely available helped us bring people in the door. I mean, I don't know if this is still true, but early on, we would find these huge spikes of viewership around things like State of the Union address and things like that, where people who didn't necessarily watch a ton of news but would want to check back in would Google where to watch these things. And they'd see NBC News, which is a brand they know. Maybe they're not familiar with the streaming service, but they could click it and they could watch it for free, and then they'd be in the door. And we could serve them ads, and we could serve them promos, and we're starting to kind of bring people back in. And we've built out our social media brands too. I mean, we have a presence on TikTok as a company and through a lot of our show brands and things like that. I mean, I still try to play on X as much as I can, but obviously that's a whole other conversation about what's going on there. But I mean, trying to meet people where they are, I think, is a huge part of this.
So a couple startling statistics that I encountered. One is that among those who get their news primarily from newspapers, Harris overwhelmingly won. Among those who get their news primarily from YouTube, Trump overwhelmingly won. Another stat I read was that those who follow political news the most closely voted overwhelmingly for Harris. And those who follow political news very little or not at all voted for Trump. Does that imply almost that Harris ran the wrong campaign? Is she running in a world of people who are highly engaged and still following traditional sources of information? And did she do, and this doesn't mean that she should have appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast. I doubt that alone would have made much of a difference. But I'm curious, Errin, for your take on that. Was she reaching the right audiences?
You know, I'm still a week out. I'm still kind of in a place where I don't think that there was much more that Kamala Harris could have done in 107 days.
Yeah.
I mean, she did a lot. I mean, she was blitzing the battleground states. She was hitting all these podcasts. You know, no, did I ever get my interview with her before the election? No, but I mean, you know, she wasn't going to mainstream legacy. I mean, to your point, like, right? Like, she's thinking, I need to get out here and show up where these potential voters are that may be checked out on some of that political news, right? Who may not necessarily be reading those newspapers, who may not be kind of the folks that are already going to vote for me. So she was galvanizing her base, showing up, you know, with black voters, coming out with a plan for black men, talking about the economy quite a bit, having influencers at the convention, you know, to be on TikTok, broadcasting the convention, you know, vertically for people that were trying to tune in on their cell phones. So, you know, I think there was a lot that the campaign did do right in terms of messaging. Now, in terms of how that messaging got out, right, and not just through a media strategy, right? Like, you need trusted messengers to also get that message out. I think we're still learning a lot about how and where the campaign invested resources, like the people on the ground who would be the people that would also need to help convince voters to support a Kamala Harris. Like, I wonder what that operation really was, because I think, you know, we hear, you know, so much energy and enthusiasm around that campaign. When she announces, you had so many thousands of people signing up to volunteer. They're texting, they're knocking doors, they're campaigning, but like, those were new people. Those were not necessarily people who kind of do this kind of work for a living in election cycles. I do wonder how much of a factor that was, but like, yeah, at the end of this, I don't think, you know, we always ask on the other side of elections, you know, was it that Harris lost or was it that Trump won?
Right.
Trump won this election.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and like I said, 107 days up against somebody who has been in our political atmosphere for 9 years.
In our consciousness for 9
Yeah, I mean, The Apprentice debuted 20 years ago this year. That's how long Donald Trump has been with us.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that? I agree. I think we can talk more about this later. I think from looking back now, I don't think there's a lot that Harris could have done differently to necessarily win. I think they had a lot of headwinds working against them, and they did have some strategic problems, but I think there's also an element of, like, you can only run the candidate you have. And Kamala Harris is not going to go on Joe Rogan for 3 hours. That's just not how she's built. I mean, I covered her in Congress before I covered the campaign. She's a fundamentally cautious person. She was more open with herself this time around. Yeah. That's not what she's going to do well. And I think there's a limit to how much that you can force. I will say, I think they did a pretty good job with their surrogates. Mm-hmm. Mark Cuban, I think, was a great surrogate for Kamala Harris, because he did do that exact same podcast circuit, the bro podcast universe that Donald Trump was doing. I listened to him do Theo Vaughn's podcast. Again, not somebody I was familiar with before this, but Trump did a long podcast with him. He's a comedian. It was very sort of humanizing for Trump. And Mark Cuban went on a few weeks later and, like, in this very jovial bro way, kind of deconstructed everything Trump said, and even had the host kind of agreeing, like, how crazy was that guy? And, you know, dropping F-bombs and kind of speaking in the colloquial way that you want to do on those programs in a way that Harris never could, but that I thought was really effective. So I think her campaign understood that they needed to play in that sandbox, but that doesn't necessarily mean they could do it with the candidate that they had.
Yeah, I think the usual take we have in political science is that it's about the party and economic and political conditions, and not only does the campaign not matter much, but the candidate doesn't matter much either. Now, maybe Trump is a special case in the sense of drawing infrequent voters in that way, not in terms of voter preference, even so much net voter preference, but in terms of turnout.
What do you make of the data that shows that Harris did better in the battleground states than in the places where she had less of a preference? I've heard that as a counter argument to the campaigns don't matter argument, that in fact, where she was really actively campaigning, she did in fact do better.
Yeah, I think that that's possible, that campaign matters a little bit. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but that doesn't matter much. That,
This is our livelihoods you're talking about here, Professor.
People, well, I think
Spend a lot of time in here.
well, it's a little like if you don't campaign, you're going to lose, right? So it's more that the campaigns can be better or worse, but they're not doing null campaigns out there. They're roughly equally funded, and from that point of view, you can make better or worse decisions, and then maybe you could talk about a 0.5% of the vote. And Harris being on the left of the Democratic Party, well, that's not so good. There is some evidence that voters prefer someone who's moderate, but it's always the case that it's not clear what to do about it, because for Democrats especially, policies that put you in the middle are often unpopular policies. So the popular policies, like give people more money, are actually kind of more left policies. And so it's complicated. But I don't think, I just think looking at it like what did the campaigns do right, what did they do wrong, is not so fruitful, even though it's a natural thing to look at.
Yeah.
No, so
Yeah, I mean, just to your point, Andrew, as much as, for me, and I wrote this in the column that I write for the 19th, the amendment, I said, elections are not just about, who these candidates are. They're about who we are as voters, as the electorate. And so, to the extent that we can understand that, and not even necessarily what the electorate did right or wrong, right? Voters get to vote, and that's how democracy works. But, that is the question that we need to be asking. What are the choices? What are the choices that they make say about who and where we are as a country?
So Andrew, you're an expert actually on the question of whether voters are rational. This was an election in which most economists who scored the proposed policies found that Harris was more fiscally responsible and that her policies would help working class people more. And yet, as we know, the only demographic among relative to 2020 that she did better with were college-educated whites. And Trump made big inroads among young voters and among male voters and including among Black and Hispanic men. 30 years ago, Andrew, you wrote an academic article, "Why are American presidential election campaign polls so variable when votes are so predictable?" Is the voting still very predictable?
Yeah, apparently. Well, campaign polls are much less variable. So back in the day,
I see.
It was that the polls would jump all over the place. There'd be huge swings. Since 2000, campaign polls have been very steady. Somehow the message got through to the actual voters, like, hey, you're going to vote for your party mostly. But before that, there was a lot more fluidity. A lot of people, months before the campaign, saying, "Oh yeah, I think I'm going to vote for this guy," even though we really knew they weren't. And then so that's changed. The outcome, the polls. The votes. Okay. To your original question, I think voters are rational, in the sense that not that they do a cost-benefit analysis, but rational in the sense that they vote for reasons. And they vote for policy reasons about who they think will be able to implement good policies. There's some evidence that in the presidential election year, voters are very sensitive to economic performance, whatever that is, which is another story, and the popularity of the current government. In off-year elections, voters are responding, often wanting to do party balancing. So it's kind of a completely different issue then.
But is it changing because we're in a lower information environment and there's a lot more misinformation? I guess that's a key question I have. I know that voters have reasons and they vote perhaps according to what they think is in their interests, but it goes back to the Thomas Frank argument. Are people voting because of cultural and identity factors, or are they voting based on a reasoned assessment of how this candidate's policies will affect me and my family?
I think people are voting mostly on a reasoned assessment, and I think that something else, but I can't remember because you said too many things at once. So it'll probably come to me.
Sorry. Okay. As opposed to the kind of the low information is that affecting people's ability to?
Well, I mean, sure. Like, I think that it is what we were talking about, the media environment, that maybe we had just a temporary period of a few decades with the kind of nonpartisan media. If you read like press critics from the 1930s and 1940s, they talked about how the Democrats, how Roosevelt won elections even though the major newspapers mostly opposed him and would lie about him, and there was not that much. The default was partisan news, although there were some somewhat nonpartisan news sources. So then for several decades there were the nonpartisan news sources, and maybe that's not going to be happening for much longer.
I think we should be careful not to lump the idea that voting on cultural reasons is a sort of a low voter information practice, right? Like, I think that's one of the sort of like dangerous ways we can sound like we're talking down to Trump voters. And this is like, you can be a high voter, you can be a high information Trump voter who's voting on cultural issues because you think that's really important. And I don't think that's necessarily a sign of misinformation or disinformation. I think this is one of those things that we have to have really sensitive antenna to, especially living and working in New York City and in Washington, D.C., that like this stuff matters, and it's not less of an issue because you can't draw a through line to it to your pocketbook issues.
Okay, first,
go ahead.
Okay, fortunately, because I'm not on TV, like I'm at the university, so I don't have to worry about offending people. Like I can say stuff, I don't have to say like, well, I have to respect people I disagree with, whatever. Okay, but so like cultural voting, sure.
There are many students here, Andrew.
There are, that of course, just in some sense, just as many Democrats are voting for cultural reasons too. Voting for cultural reasons is not something that is done only by conservatives. When we studied this a few years ago, although things may have changed, we did find that the voters, the richer voters, the more educated voters, the voters who had more information, had more coherent political stances and were more likely, their votes were more predictable based on social issues. So traditionally it was the lower information people who are voting more based on their, more congruent with their economic ideology. And there's a sense in which voting for social issues is a kind of luxury that upper income voters are more likely to do. But
absolutely, and I think, I think the other thing here, when we think about kind of what a storyline that we missed, right? I mean, like there was a lot of focus going into this year that, this was the first election, post-Roe, presidential election. This was also the first post-pandemic election. And we have not reckoned as a country with the consequences, like just what people went through in that pandemic and the effect that had on the electorate and the choices that they might be making headed into November. I think that matters. I think, to Andrew's point, we kept hearing again and again, the economy was the #1 issue for people. That was the #1 thing that they said that they cared about. What does that mean for people depending on who you are and where you are in the country, who and where you are class-wise, right? Like, I'm not somebody who has to worry about how my mortgage is getting paid or if my car is going to get repossessed. I'm not somebody who has to worry about those things. So, like, talking to somebody who does have to worry about those things, those people are maybe not as concerned with social issues as they are with the person who is going to make them feel like they are fundamentally going to change their lives on the other side of the election. However real or not real that may be, like, is Donald Trump really going to lower the price of your groceries? Probably not.
Probably not. Well, I would read 10,000 words from somebody smarter than me on where the pandemic went in this election.
I'll get going.
Please, because it never came up, but it was obviously such a factor.
It was looming over all of it, and we didn't.
We've culturally memory hold the whole 2-year thing that we all went through.
But wait, in terms of
it's clearly still there.
In terms of inflation, or in terms of the long-term impact on our families?
The longer term. I mean, it's just
on everything.
All the ways our lives are different, and all the ways our politics are different. I mean, it's part of the reason Donald Trump got thrown out of office the first time, right?
How we went from looking out for everybody to looking out for ourselves.
So is it possible that we're talking about campaigns and candidates and issues and identity, but in fact, any generic Republican running on the fury over inflation would have beaten any Democrat, Biden or someone else?
Maybe.
I think that's the default.
again, that's underestimating Trump's hold on his people, right? I mean, Garrett and I both were talking about this. I mean, I was in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention. It was right after that first assassination attempt. Every single person in that arena believed that God had spared Donald Trump so that he could become the president of the United States. Like, they were locked in.
Yeah.
And this is after his criminal trial. This is after E. Jean Carroll. This is after all of it. Didn't matter. And by the way, they're not getting any real information about that stuff on the news outlets that they're consuming.
So it's almost like a quasi-religious element.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. And it was about how he made them feel and how he has made them feel. Right? Kamala Harris had 107 days to make people feel a certain way, and she made a lot of people feel a certain way, right? Like, joy was definitely a strategy that was highly effective for many people, just not enough people.
But also, Joe Biden was a historically weak candidate for re-election. I mean, he was a disaster down the stretch in most, sort of ways that you would score it, right, in terms of his actual performance. And if he turned in that debate performance against Ron DeSantis or John Thune or candidate X, still would have been in a real deep hole.
And how was he making people feel, especially on the economy, right? He's telling people the economy's great when people's personal economy was not feeling so great.
He was telling them Bidenomics, and they were feeling...
They're like, but what about the bacon? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I care about bacon too, by the way, just so we are clear. Very important.
Andrew, to what extent has the public become over-reliant on polling? I mean, I feel, we all followed people named Nate and, their gut instincts and what they were telling us. And I remember getting, to 3 days before the election, and basically it was like, we don't know. We don't really know. Do you consider this to have been a polling error or this year or not in the scheme of things? I think some people might say he won all 7 swing states. How could there not be a polling error? But I think those who know polls know that if it's within the margin of error, it's within the margin.
Wait, do you want me to answer? Or?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, the polls are off by about 2 or 3 percentage points, and which was about as much as they're off in 2020 and a little more than they're off in 2016. So it was a polling error. It's non-sampling error. It was in the margin of recent historical polling errors, which is why the forecasts, including ours, had quite a bit of uncertainty. So I think that was conveyed well. I'll just say, back in the day when I was young, polls would be reported differently. They'd say, here's a poll, and here's the margin of error, and a candidate would be at 53% in the polls, and there'd be a 3% margin of error, or they'd be at 55%, and there'd be a 3% margin of error, and you'd say, well, yeah, but things can change. Polls are much more accurate now than they were decades ago. In terms of lining up with the election. It wasn't as polls are pretty far off in 1980. I heard a rumor back in 1948 they were off. A lot of elections, in 1996, they were off by a couple percentage points. I think what happened was that 2008, the polls just by luck happened to have 0 non-sampling error. And then people made these silly things like, oh, so-and-so did poll aggregation and he got 47 or 49 states out of 50. It's like ridiculous, right? You get 45 states out of 50 for free. And then the others, there happened to be no polling error, and so it made everybody look good. It's like I say, like when you're doing statistics, as a statistician, you think what makes you look good is you have a really hard problem that you solve. No, what makes you look good is the same thing in baseball. What makes you look good is a nice slow pitch down the middle that you can hit over the fence. You don't get extra credit for hitting a tricky pitch, right? And so when the polls are great and you have good data, then they look great. After 2008, there was some overconfidence. We did not really return to how we used to, the news did not return to how it used to report polls. Given that we're going to have poll aggregation, I think the aggregates were reported reasonably. There was a lot of uncertainty. It was always accepted that the polls could be off, they could be missing people, or perhaps an issue would turn out, which is what happened. Now, if you're actually a pollster, you want to do better, for sure.
And I'm not Andrew or Nate Silver. I just want to start with that caveat. But what I will say is that, the thing about polls, especially for us in the news business, like, they point us in a direction. Like, if we are not going to talk to the people behind those polls, we are not doing our job. Like we have to, like there's nothing I love more than a callback when I get some poll results. Give me some phone numbers of people that participated in this poll. Like we conducted a poll at the 19th. We talked to women, we talked to people of color, we talked to LGBTQ folks, people from the disability community, the caregiving community, people that normally do not get polled because it's too expensive or whatever. Talking to those people and hearing how they felt about the issues that, I mean, they have the same priorities as all Americans, right? But like what they meant by this issue is a priority for me, like hearing from them about that and how that was going to influence what they were going to do with the ballot box was, I mean, that was so instructive for us. I mean, because I mean, one of the main reasons we started the 19th was because we did not want to be doing horse race journalism, right? Like who's up, who's down on any given day. Like last time I checked, Joe Biden cannot get pregnant, so like I'm not asking you about reproductive access, right? But yeah, I mean, talking.
It'd be a big story.
Yeah, wouldn't it though? But yeah, I mean, talking to people about their responses, not just saying here are the numbers and not really trying to figure out what they mean.
And I'll pull back the curtain a little bit on how we do look at polling at NBC. We've tried really hard to do this in a more responsible way, and I think it's definitely something we could continue to improve. But we have a political unit and a standards unit who work together. Every time a new poll sort of comes across the transom, we would dump it into a Slack channel or an email and say, what do we think about this? And our political unit would look at the methodology for the poll. We have pollsters who we have approved in the past. We have some that we don't use because we don't like their methodology. And we would basically somebody would have to like send a note saying like, all right, this poll is approved. We looked at the methodology. We think it's good. Make sure you point out the margin of error when you report it. And if you're going to report this one, you should probably also report this other one from 4 days ago that had a similar result, or that this one is an outlier based on these other 4 from a week ago. And I try to put all these things in context. But I think there is such a proliferation of polls being conducted now by universities and news organizations and private political groups that there's still a tendency to chase this shiny object to kind of feed the beast on cable and online, and we're sort of constantly fighting that battle of like, how do we accurately present what is, we think, high quality information to the degree we can support it with more interviews and things like that even better, and how do we cull what is, sort of garbage in, garbage out, not reliable data?
Well, I think we can all agree that there's too many polls. Way too many. It's not a good use of resources. Someone asked me about why are you doing all this poll aggregation. I said, all the work we did for poll aggregation, it was like maybe I spent a couple hours, my colleague here, Ben Goodrich, spent 10 hours, we had a student spend some time, there's a couple of people at The Economist who did it part-time. All of our effort put together is not 1/10 of the effort in one poll in one state. Of course you should do the news and aggregate, but it's ludicrous that there are so many polls. It's ludicrous when you go online 4 weeks before the election and someone says, whatever the active news obsessive, we need another poll in so-and-so state. You don't need that. It's horrible. Yeah.
Well, and there's a concern that there are bad faith actors out there commissioning polls,
especially the closer we get to the election.
Right, to cook the books on those aggregators. If they can throw in a couple of polls that show Trump +4, it throws the aggregation back the other direction. And so everybody's paranoid about the data that we're getting.
In a 2-candidate election, I don't see that that's going to matter so much. If you talk about in primary elections, I think that would be a bigger deal, because there you have a lot more strategic voting.
Interesting.
So we're about to move to student Q&A, which I'm really looking forward to. My final question is, I want to return to the topic of the media. A theme I've heard is that I think the press has actually been much more transparent about our methods. The Associated Press this year explained the hell out of every decision they make, the underlying data, the models, et cetera. Journalists like you both are doing reporting around the country, and yet more and more people seem to be getting their information from sources that are not particularly engaged in reporting per se. Does that mean that we're just in a world of endless commentary? Does it mean, and it doesn't necessarily mean misinformation, but they're getting their news from, kind of talk radio, from hip personalities, influencers, TikTok, and from people that they believe they have an authentic relationship with. How do we respond to that challenge as journalists?
We cannot continue to be so precious about the method of delivery, right? I mean, if I'm getting steak from DoorDash, and it's still delicious, I'm good with that. I don't need to sit in the fancy restaurant to get the steak, right? Like we have got to stop being so yeah, will I go call your daddy? Yes, I will be a guest on that show. Like, will I be a guest on some of these podcasts where people are and they maybe we're not expecting to have a conversation about politics, but yet here we are talking about the things that you care about, right? Oh, and by the way, subscribe to the 19th, it's free. I have a newsletter and a podcast, right? Like that's how you reach people. But I think we now that we are transitioning into kind of the governing phase of politics season for now, because P.S. the midterms are right around the corner. Yeah, I think that we do have to continue to try to engage with people because I mean I think what we cannot underestimate that when you have 140 million people participating, and that's a lot of people that actually are interested in our process. So like they're looking for something to do now. Well, they're making Thanksgiving dinner. But I mean, other than that, like when they get through kind of checking out and recovering from this election, they will be looking for something. And what is it that we are prepared to give them? And are we prepared to meet them where they are?
You start 2 weeks in advance? I do it like on Wednesday.
I got to practice the recipes, okay? I can't be, you're not going to talk about me.
Turkey Wednesday.
You winging it out here. You just
literally winging it, yeah.
Winging it.
I don't have a good and easy answer to that. I mean, takes are cheap and easy, and quality news production is hard and oftentimes expensive, and so it's definitely a challenge. But I think you're absolutely right about the means of delivery. I think the transparency is really key, especially to reestablish trust with people who don't have it. And I think authenticity from the people who are doing the news is important. At least,
yes.
To the degree that you know who I am and you kind of have a vague idea of where I come from and that I'm giving you what I really think, I think can matter more than a sort of false projection of objectivity or a voice of God anchor, right? I think those things I think we're pivoting away from that kind of thing into a more transparent form of delivery.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's difficult because I think that the news media are being asked to do more than one thing. So John Kenneth Galbraith talked about the idea of countervailing power, and if you go back to the 1930s and say, how did Roosevelt win elections, even though the main corporate press was against him, that they had labor unions and they had the equivalent of podcasters of the day, they had machine politics and so forth. I think a lot of conservatives felt that they needed to develop their own media organizations because their point of view was not being expressed in the news media. And you're in the position of sort of simultaneously trying to tell the truth and defuse things in the media environment. Like, I think it does require, like, traditional sources of political mobilization aren't around anymore. So there's a hollowing out and there's a kind of relying on the press as a form of mobilization, which really was not the case before. So I think it's a big concern.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Okay, we'll be taking questions. Please come to the microphones. And we're going to do about 2 or 3 questions at a time and then turn to the panelists.
Hi, Professor Gelman. There was a lot of herding in the polls this year. Nate Silver, in an article a few days before the election, said that if you look at all the swing state polls that were conducted in October, the odds of all of them being that close was 1 in 9.5 trillion. And his article was headlined as more herding in swing state polls than sheep in the Scottish Highlands. I was wondering what you feel would be an appropriate way to ensure that there are checks and balances, either in newsrooms that are collaborating with pollsters or at the pollsters themselves, to ensure that we don't see as much herding in future elections, because they throw the aggregators off, they throw the averages off, and could result in huge inaccuracies.
Andrew, do you want to take that?
Oh yeah, I'm not really so concerned about that. Although I've never been to Scotland, so I can't really comment on what Nate said there. But yeah, I feel that there's an issue that there's systematic error, as I said, some combination of differential non-response and voter turnout. And differential non-response, pollsters try to adjust for by adjusting for known differences between sample and population. Maybe they could do better. Maybe they could do more interaction with maybe more local geographic modeling interacted with demographics and partisanship could help. I'm not sure. I don't think like this herding thing, like who cares? Like what's some ideal thing where people are giving more variable numbers and they're still going to be averaged, that's not going to make the bias go away. So I don't really care.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for being here with us today. Throughout this conversation, we keep returning to the idea of the economy as a key factor in forming voter preferences. But by many measures, the economy is actually doing very well. Inflation is down, unemployment is down, yes, prices are up. But I suppose my question is then, how as journalists do you sort of adhere to objectivity while also reporting on voter preferences and perceptions that the economy is doing poorly, while also reporting the objective facts about the economy? And then additionally, throughout the 2024 election, whether it be through statistical modeling or through journalism, where do you think this perception that the economy is doing poorly came from?
I mean, I can take a quick swing at that. I mean, I think it's almost entirely boils down to prices. That at the end of the day, inflation is down, but prices aren't, right? So, I mean, yes, we can look at data and show that things are moving the right direction in terms of inflation cooling, but if things are still expensive, and historically they don't get cheaper, right? I mean, so I think that's the biggest problem. It is a huge disconnect between the sort of vibes and the data. I will say, most people are not in the stock market, so the stock market being up is a disconnect, is a data point that is absolutely true and also not especially relevant to some of these voters that we're talking about. And a colleague of mine has this saying, and it's a little glib for this, but I think it's appropriate, that voters say please, but they don't say thank you. And so there's this tendency towards okay, great, unemployment's down, I have a job, that's fine, but what are you doing for me now? Right? And so I think that's where some of that disconnect is. But we try to balance that out, I think, in the coverage that, yes, data point X, Y, and Z say one thing, but voters are persistently telling us they don't feel secure in this economy. And sometimes that runs counter to, the sort of economic data points.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. My Instacart delivery person is not on the stock market, right? That is not what she's doing. So, full stop. Also, if I could make an app, it would be a tracker of grocery prices that people could just see every day, because that is really what people care so much about. I mean, people think about, your neighbors are not talking to you about, well, maybe my neighbors are not talking to me about Bitcoin and and what the price is of Bitcoin right now is on the stock market, but they will say, I paid this much for eggs, or did you see how much the gas was up the street? Or the gas is this much cheaper across town. You should go get some gas over there today, right? That really is people's personal economies. That is the thing that they cared about. That was the thing that they were paying attention to. And you think about, people's ability to go on vacation as a family, people's ability to put their kid in summer camp or pay for extracurricular activities for them to do, those were the things. If that stuff went up, people noticed and they were pissed.
Here's another thing for the 10,000 words you're going to write me on the pandemic too.
Yes.
This is also expiring benefits for things like childcare, which is enormously expensive, and when people were getting supported during the pandemic, the checks stopped coming. That doesn't show up in the economic data points, but the expiration of a lot of those pandemic supports for people, I think, is another thing that affected the vibes, but that doesn't necessarily show up in the top line economic data.
Thank you, editor, for reminding me of that. Yes, that is absolutely, the post-pandemic effect, I think, was also part of that economy discussion as well.
I read a recent study that people think that when the Fed raises rates, they're actually contributing to the inflation and don't understand that you raise it's actually understandable in a way that if you haven't studied it, it's hard to understand the idea that when the Fed raises rates, it's actually to bring down the rate of inflation. The consumer price level is about 20% higher than it was pre-COVID. And I think people are feeling that, even though the headline inflation number, of course, is declining. But that
and their wages aren't going up. right? They have a job, but their wages are not moving, but somehow now the car that I wanted costs more money than it cost before.
Yeah.
And by the way, I'll just add, I'm sorry, I'll just add, like, this is going to be a problem for Trump, because as we talk about how to cover him as president, like, he made promises to my viewers that this is going to get better. And his policies don't point in a direction of making this better, right? And we tried to cover that as a candidate, and we're going to cover it aggressively as the president, that, like, this is now a problem that he has to own. And I think we'll see how that goes.
Hi, so my question was about when you mentioned the rational voter and how one votes rationally, and I was wondering how media with, like, contemporary media with information and a lot of disinformation has impacted how rationally a voter votes. And I was wondering, in a sense, why do we have the impression that sometimes a voter votes against his interests, and if that has to do with disinformation?
The rationality would suggest not that you vote for your personal interest, but that you vote for the country's interest. Because your chance of affecting the election is a single vote is very small. To the extent, however, if your vote makes a difference, it's very consequential, not so much for you, but for the country. So I think of voting as like buying a lottery ticket where there's a 1 in 10 million chance that you will give an incredible benefit to 300 million people. And so it's rational for that decision to be based on what you think is good for the country. Well, of course, I think like more funding on education would be good for the country. Like, it's no coincidence that things that are good for me, I think are good for the country, but it's not a selfish issue. I think it makes sense for people to be other-seeking and think about things like, well, lots of people like me would be better off if blah, 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 blah. That's my take.
That is so interesting that you say, and I love that you think about your vote as a, like, the vote that each of us cast affects all of us. Like, that is true, and I think that is what a lot of people believe, but I think that there are some people who are we voters and there are some people who are me voters. And I do think that, I mean, rational voters, like, they're voting based on the information that they have wherever they are getting it, right? They're making a choice based on the information that they are getting. So if they're not getting rational information, does that make them an irrational voter? Right? I mean, if I watch Fox News regularly just to see what's going on, just to see what the conversation is. I watch it regularly. And if I was somebody who was consuming a steady diet of Fox News, I would not be surprised, you know, that somebody that is consuming Fox News regularly would be a Trump supporter, or would not be a supporter of the Biden and Harris administration. I would not be surprised by that.
I don't know that I have anything to add to that. I mean, I think, sort of relatedly to this, that we have to be careful what we call disinformation and misinformation too, because I think that has become a blanket term that can mean almost anything. But yeah, I mean, I think it's information in and vote preference out is not
selective reporting.
So Garrett,
maybe a better way.
Selective reporting.
It's interesting, Garrett. I've started to use the term misinformation less, and disinformation is really, I think, more, I associate more with like state actors.
Yeah.
But misinformation and fake news are in the eye of the beholder in many ways. And oftentimes the accusation is that, you know, elites use that term to refer to information they don't agree with. But I do think that hyperpartisanship and media manipulation are terms that I think are quite valid still.
Yeah.
Because essentially you have a world of organizations like the ones represented on this stage who are still trying to do a traditional form of journalism that's highly factually precise and tries its best to be fair. We can leave the term objectivity to a J-School seminar. And then there's a whole world of media and information that's really has a very, very different purpose. And those worlds are kind of coexisting now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, no, that's not a particularly satisfying answer.
It's not our job to satisfy.
Hello.
I love
for
it,
the
Andrew.
conference. So I have two questions, but they kind of linked to one of them, and perhaps it's more specific to Andrew. So I'm a current QMSS alumni, basically, and I did study like statistical methods before. So I'm just wondering, like, how could you, like, you know, we have podcasts and we have new ways of communication to get our information. I was wondering what kind of methods would you use to improve, like, accuracy, to try to get a good sample that would represent, you know, the larger population? And the second question I have is more related to IA, because I believe that in the coming years, with the IA boom, it's going to affect a lot what's going to happen in the next election. And therefore, I'm wondering how could we, how can I say, like, limit the effect on IA on the election such that we get a result that demonstrates accuracy in a good way.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you're asking, though, like specifically. I mean, I think with polling, it's hard to reach people. Although, as I said, polls are more accurate now than they were decades ago. But I think a lot of effort is spent trying to understand who those people are who don't respond. But yeah, I don't know. Can't really answer your question because I didn't really understand it, sorry.
The AI thing is a huge challenge. I mean, at NBC, we ran all these scenarios about ways in which bad faith actors might use AI on election day or around it to mess with the election. You know, somebody put a deep fake video on of the president saying something, or of some news anchor saying the president has been shot and we're canceling the election. I mean, this is, I think, a whole of society, you know, challenge to solve for. I was the victim of a deep fake scenario in which I was anchoring a show and somebody put words that I very much didn't say and tweeted it out as like a joke, but it went, you know, NBC freaked out about it for obvious reasons. I mean, this is a huge issue for actual real life disinformation, to put words into other people's mouths, and it is a huge problem for our industry going forward.
And it sounded like you because it was based on audio recordings of things you've actually said. Yeah, that's terrifying, actually. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here tonight. I'm a student at journalism school, and I was very happy when one of you said that we should find ways to get people who have gave up with traditional media to come back to the tent or something like that. But how do you think that we are actually going to do that in this country?
I think there are a couple ways. I think some of it is delivery method, which we talked about a little bit, going where people are and making sure we have vertical videos you can watch on your phone, and that if you search for us online, if you don't have cable anymore or don't watch TV, but on election night or on some big political night you want to find us, you know how to find us. You know, NBC, we have partnerships with Apple News, for example, to get some of our stuff there. I mean, some of it's delivery. Some of it is transparency, which we also talked about, to try to increase trust that we're not shadowy elites in New York City telling you what the news, like we're talking down to you about what the news is. It's like, no, this is how we gather it. This is where we are. We're in your community. The most trusted news organizations in the country tend to be local news outlets. Yep. They're deeply embedded in their communities. You see, I was a local news reporter before I came to NBC. I would see my viewers in the grocery store, and if they had feelings about what I did on TV, they would tell me. And like, trying to find ways, social media I think is actually kind of helpful in this regard because people feel like they can have a connection to the people who are giving you your news. I'm sure you probably find this too with your model. So I think there are a number of like small ways that we can do this, but credibility is super important and it takes a long time to grow that.
Yeah, I'm looking for a donor so that we can stick our logo on the New York Liberties jerseys. Like, I think that would help get us a long way to exposing, the 19th News to a lot more people. No, I mean, look, I do think, Sewell talked about how transparent the Associated Press was this whole election season about what they were doing, how they were going to be calling the election, why their election results could be trusted. Like, they went a long way to doing that. I think that more of us, like to the extent that we can show our work to people, and for us to remember that we do have to earn people's trust. Like, our news organization is only 4 years old. This is our second presidential election, right? So we're still introducing ourselves to a lot of people. We're still trying to gain the trust of a lot of people. What's really wild to me is that, even though we're not that old, especially in a lot of conservative outlets, like they already saw us as mainstream media, right? That maybe shouldn't be trusted. Like, what are you going to do with my words? Do you really want to hear from us? So like making the case to them that like, yes, like you are a part of this democracy. We want to hear from everybody. We need to understand who is in this electorate and how they are participating in this electorate, right? Like that's a case that we have to make each and every single day. We can't just assume that folks are going to find us. We can't just assume that people automatically trust us. Like, that is a relationship that we must also cultivate. and not just expect. And I think that is something that local news does very well.
Well said.
Thank you.
Hi, I wonder if the panel could react, especially NBC News, to the criticism that the story of Joe Biden's diminution didn't really get developed or probed until July of 2024. And that was certainly consequential for the amount of time Kamala Harris had. And there has been criticism that Democratic bias, Biden administration bias, prevented the mainstream media from probing for this story, which was certainly hidden by his inner circle, at a time when, many months before, it was appearing in the alternative press and in Fox News, et cetera.
I think, broadly speaking, it's an interesting criticism. I would encourage you to go read a story my colleague Peter Nicholas did in, I think, April or May on the topic of how the Biden White House was keeping Joe Biden out of the spotlight for fears that he was declining in public. So we were doing some of this. I can tell you the White House was pushing back very aggressively on that reporting as we were doing it in real time. But yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of a worthy topic to go back and look at. The White House has a lot of tools to keep the president out of the spotlight when they want to and limit his exposure. And so it's sort of like, how do you report, what do you do with the dog that doesn't bark? But I think we tried to get at that. I know we did at NBC. But I think it's going to be one of those things that will continue to be developed after he leaves office and the books and things like that start coming out in real time. I agree, broadly speaking, it's a worthy criticism. I mean, I think it was something that you're trying to approach respectfully, but also with the understanding that it is like a very important issue, and you can't just look away from it either, so.
Do you think it was partly a reaction because in 2020 he was very quiet in the campaign of the general election, and then maybe there was a feeling that he had been underestimated, and like there may have been a reaction to that?
I mean, I think that's probably part of it. I also, candidly, I mean, I covered the primary in 2020. I covered a lot of Joe Biden events. I remember the very first Biden event I covered in 2020. I walked away thinking there was no way this guy could win an election. And he was a very uneven campaigner, even in this would have been summer of 2019. Right. And so, you know, I think the writing was on the wall, but the difference between is this and you know, I have not been covering this White House, so I want to be careful. Like, sort of, what was a cognitive issue versus what is sort of the guy who always was this way and is kind of an unusual Uncle Joe.
And he has 2020 pandemic. This man was at home for the home stretch of the general election, or was doing rallies in parking lots at great distance from everybody. Yeah, I mean that election was not typical for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm. But he was certainly bubble wrapped by this White House, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, but also, what about? I mean, you could just, from an accountability perspective, I guess, kind of to your point. Didn't you say you were going to be a transition president? Mm-hmm. What happened? Start there, right? You said you were one term and done, but then you're announcing your reelection. Yeah. Like that, but we didn't have that conversation either.
Yeah. Well, I think issues of presidential age and health are going to continue being ripe issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you discussed how we have mainstream media is people are less watching that, and maybe voters watch more Fox News, but how we see that there's so many Republicans, or not only, people that voted for Trump that aren't Republican, for example, are not necessarily only voters that watch Fox News. There are a lot of well-read voters and who also read a lot more of academic journalism. Would you not see this as maybe a failure of media coverage, of a certain disconnect with the average voters of what was really important? And although you did discuss the fact that today you realize that the economy was important, that doesn't seem like it was the most important thing that was covered on the media during the time of the elections. That was very much overlooked, and there were a lot of sensational issues that were discussed about Trump, and people were very sure almost, except the few days before the elections, that Trump wasn't really going to win. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, well, we knew that people thought about the economy first, but that didn't seem to be covered a lot by the mainstream and discussed issue that apparently wasn't important enough for voters.
I would just object entirely to your statement that people were very sure that Trump was not going to win, because the forecasts were always saying that it was that it could go either way. So I mean, maybe you felt that way, but I mean that wasn't what was reported in the press at all. That it was I mean, it was reported that this was a very volatile election, and I do think, there is a tendency to report on campaign events because that's what's news. Like to say, well, the economy is continuing to get a little bit better, but people are uncertain. Like there's a limit to how many times. I mean, you're the news people. You talk.
Well, to your point about the economy not being the main driving narrative of this election, I think that that's true. I think that we were covering President Trump's legal challenges, certainly, right? We were covering the things that he was saying and doing at his rallies, right? Misogynist statements that he was making, racist statements that he was making. But the thing of it is, there was half the population that saw those things and was just like horrified by it. Oh my goodness, what are we doing? Can't believe we're about to do this again. And yet there's another half of the country for whom they're not worried about any of that, right? They're saying, I care about the economy and immigration. Mm-hmm. And that's, whatever else he's been saying and doing those things all
well,
this
I would
time.
say.
Not interested. Or I may hate those things, but I am also voting for this person. And I think that was the follow-up that we didn't do enough. Like there were people who might have said, don't love the things that he's saying or doing. But then not enough people were also asking, but who are you going to vote for, though? Mm-hmm. Right? Because they were still totally fine voting for him.
Let me just emphasize, I mean, you know this, but you're talking about the marginal voter. I mean, most of the voters for either party, it's not even about a particular issue. Like most of the Democrats are like, I'm going to vote for a Democrat because there's a bunch of things they stand for. Or if you're a Republican, mostly, the economy and immigration's part of it. It's more like these Democrats are crazy people. We need steady hand on the tiller, and the economy and immigration is part of that. So we're always talking about those people in the middle that they're all fighting over, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree that any of it was a failure, because I do feel like if you were watching, if you were engaging with the content that an organization like NBC was putting out, I think you had a very good picture of what these two candidates were about and what they said they cared about, what we were able to fact check about their ability to actually address the issues that they said they cared about, and the American people delivered their own judgment on which of those sets of facts were more important. I also think looking back now, it's a lot easier to see that the signs were there that this is the way it was going to go. And at the time, it can be very difficult to differentiate which of these things are going to matter more. But looking back now, we've got 70% of the country pretty consistently said we were on the wrong track. Joe Biden's approval rating hovering around 40%, totally underwater. She was never particularly able to separate herself from Biden. In the noise of a campaign, it can be hard to tell which one of these sort of factors. I mean, Trump was also historically unpopular too.
Yes, and we knew this was going to be it could have gone either, it really could have gone either way. We knew that going into last week.
But until people vote, you don't know which one of those things are actually going to be the most important to them. And I think that's where you get in trouble. And for all the talk about the polling, I mean, in a margin of error election, which this basically was, I mean, Trump's going to have an electoral blowout, but ultimately we're talking about a very narrow slice of the country that makes this decision. Getting into the specifics of what's going to matter more to those people and what's going to matter more to those people who stayed home, which is a whole other story we haven't talked about, the 10 million voters who stayed home this time, is a thing it's just hard to know until it's over. And I know that feels like a cop-out, but it's true.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, I just wanted to ask if you think that a lot of Americans have turned away from traditional media, mainly the main networks, as you know, because they don't have faith in the media anymore. They think it's too partisan. As you were saying, Fox News is biased, but many people would say MSNBC is just as biased as Fox. And going forward, hopefully the Democrats will reflect on why they lost this election. But the media, traditional media, do you think they'll also reflect on perhaps they were more partial to the Democrats than they were to the Republicans?
As a card-carrying member of the traditional media, I think the answer is yes. I mean, we're very much reflecting on that. And I think you have to be specific about what you're talking about, too. I mean, MSNBC Primetime in particular those are progressive programs,
Yes.
right? Those are point of view programs. They do a different thing necessarily than what I'm doing for Today's Show and Nightly News. I mean, I'm a broadcaster, so I'm hopeful that my stories are reaching a broad segment of society. I mean, Today's Show, I don't know if this is still true, but Today's Show used to be sort of our like least, when viewers would describe it in surveys, it's our least politicized brand. And to the degree that I would come across Trump voters who engage with my reporting, that's where they were most likely to see it, and on Nightly News. And so, you know, adjusting the tone in such a way that I can still report really critically on Donald Trump, but I can do it in a way that feels respectful to people who are going to vote for him anyway, I think is a way that we have to approach this to keep those people in the tent and to keep them watching. And I said this earlier, but I'll go back to it because I've decided this is my ethos going forward, covering his administration, is his voters are my audience, and he made promises to them, and now it's my job to hold him accountable for the promises he made to my audience. And I think that's a good frame for us going forward, where it should be oppositional, right? Your coverage of any politician should be oppositional.
Oppositional, but not ideological.
Yeah, but not ideological. So I think that's a very fine line to walk, but that's the goal.
That's a great note to end on, but I'd like to now bring up Dean Jelani Cobb of the Columbia Journalism School to bring this talk to a close.
So I think that, you know, I could have listened to you all talk for much longer. We don't have as much time with this space, but you know, I think that this conversation has been enlightening. I certainly learned things as I was listening to you all. You know, what was it, Andrew? Our job is not to like make you happy. What was it?
Right.
I know.
Channel Andrew.
I was going to write that down, put that on my wall. And thank you to everyone who is watching the live stream. I would also like to thank our partner on this, the SIPA Institute of Global Politics, who, you know, we as Columbia Journalism School were very happy to work with. Also, we want to thank President Katrina Armstrong, you know, Sewell Chan, Andrew Gelman, Garrett Haake, Errin Haines, and of course, my collaborator on this, Dean Karen Yarhi Milo, as well as also I should thank all of my team from Columbia Journalism School that worked on this, who are, you know, over there toward the back. And so thank you and have a good night.